tonight we're going to talk about the Appalachian Trail in Georgia, and thought it would be a good program to have because this is really the most accessible and nearby mountain hiking experience for all of us in Northeast Florida. It's really quite approachable. It's just 7 to 8 hours to get to most of these trailheads. And so I wanted to put together a presentation for you all on this. And when I did this and I finished it, we had probably about an hour and a half program. So I've divided it up into 3 parts. And so we're going to do part 1 tonight. And that's for just covering Springer Mountain, which is the beginning of the trail, to Woody Gap. And then next week, we will have a program and we'll be talking about part 2, which will be the second section of the trail that I'm going to talk about. And the following week, we will have no program because that would be Thanksgiving. And then the week after that, which is December 3rd, we'll be doing part 3 of this program. So we'll see. There's a lot of information at the beginning that I'll be repeating throughout these 3 programs because it has to do with the history of the trail and something about the area. So we will see how that goes. And if we have the same people come to each of the 3 programs, we can kind of whip through that section and get to more of the trail. Then in December 10th, we'll have another program. Bill Armstrong will be giving a program about a local trail. I think tentatively he's going to be doing the trails of Jennings State Forest. Then for the next 3 weeks, we're going to be taking off for the holidays, so we will not have programs. Then we'll be resuming this weekly Thursday night program in January, and we'll have another 4 programs in January. And then at that point, we'll see where we're at with the Sierra Club and continuing with our outdoor outings, and we can maybe stop doing these virtual outings as much and get outdoors more. So anyway, tonight we're going to talk about the Appalachian Trail in Georgia, and we're going to talk about this first section from Springer Mountain to Woody Gap. I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Appalachian Trail. I'm going to talk about the natural environment of North Georgia and the cultural history of the area. And then we'll talk about these 3 sections that I've divided the Georgia Trail into. And then we're just going to take a hike and see some of the sites and some of the memorable landmarks along the trail. So the history of the Appalachian Trail is really interesting. It began with this gentleman, Benton Mackay, in the late teens, early 20s. He was sort of a visionary regional planner in New England and sort of had this idea that the world was becoming overly mechanized, overly automated, overly urbanized. This was when the automobile was just starting to make its appearance, and there's more cars on the streets, there are more tramways, there are more trolleys in the cities. And he envisioned this idea of a regional plan for the whole East Coast that would be a retreat for urban dwellers and would assist with preserving the wilderness and keeping the urbanization out and preserving our natural resources. He was kind of the big picture guy, and he had the idea that what would facilitate that vision would be a trail that would be a wilderness trail that one could go on and hike, and that would sort of set the tone for a less urbanized environment. But this was difficult to do because it takes a lot of work to create these trails and maintain these trails. And so a couple of other people came along, Arthur Perkins and Myron Avery, and they're the ones that actually made it happen. They took his vision and decided that they needed to focus on making the trail, building this trail, and came up with a process. And an action plan for actually getting it done. And so they set up their allegiances with national and state forest organizations. They had a lot of connections in Washington, D.C. And then they decided that it really needed to have a decentralized organization of different clubs of mountaineer type people and outdoorsy people that would want to get out and maintain this on a volunteer basis and actually build the trail on a volunteer basis. They also thought that we would need shelters along the way to help with the hikers so they could hike the trail and have a place to rest at night. So they had this idea of a system of shelters, and that was another thing they did a lot of. And so from the 20s, they kept working on it and finally completed the first route of the Appalachian Trail from Georgia all the way to Maine in 1937. And the Georgia section itself was completed in 1930. So the trail got completed with a lot of work and a lot of focus on the part of Myron Avery in particular. And then what they realized was that the trail itself could be destroyed by civilization encroaching upon it. So, you know, there was some building beginning to happen back in the rural areas. There was, for example, there was the Skyline Highway that was being built as part of the Depression era Public Works program in Virginia. That was an early crisis in the trail. They had to reroute a lot of the trail because of that. So these early organizers realized that it was not just a trail, but a trailway. They had to think about protecting a border of lands that would keep this trail in a fairly natural condition so that that experience of a rural hike could be maintained. And what's evolved in later years of the Appalachian Trail is this idea of a greenway, where we're not just preserving a 1 mile strip on either side of the trail, but we're protecting an entire environmental ecosystem as it became understood in later years. I got some chat here. Okay. Someone said something about an email. Okay, well, we'll get to this later. So that's what it's evolved to become. And part of what enabled that was in 1968, the National Trail Systems Act was enacted. And this act allows for the creation of national scenic trails that are protected, and they're enacted by an act of Congress. So our Florida Trail is also a Florida National Scenic Trail. There's 11 of them in the country now. So the Appalachian Trail itself is 2,193 miles long, goes through 14 states. It's the longest hiking only footpath in the world. So even it's one of the oldest, it's one of the best hiking paths anywhere. There's 464,500 feet of elevation change. That's kind of impossible to even imagine, but that's the total of all the ups and downs along this entire trail. It's getting very popular. There are over 3 million visitors who hike part of the trail every year. It's maintained still completely by volunteers. And there's an umbrella organization called the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. And each state has affiliated Appalachian Trail hiking groups. So the part that we're going to talk about today is right down here in the very corner, the very beginning of this whole long Appalachian Trail. And these numbers here are the average days it takes to hike through these different sections. So as you can see, this Georgia section is only 8 of the several, well, 10, I don't know, 200 days that it takes to hike. So, So the area is very interesting. Some of the history there, the Cherokee Indians settled the area in the 1700s. They were forcibly removed by settlers in 1838 who were clearing the area for development. And the Civil War devastated this mountain area. There were actually skirmishes between Union and Confederate loyalists because the people up in Appalachia weren't always interested in going and fighting and dying for the wealthy plantation owners down in the flatlands. So there are actually quite a few loyalists in the mountains who had skirmishes all the time in these mountains and these hollers with the Confederate troops that were up there. So I just sometimes think about, as I hike through these beautiful mountains, of the Indian battles and the Civil War battles that happened in this rough terrain, and just thought about people living at that time. So following the Civil War, there was a lot of land speculation because minerals were discovered in the area. And of course, there was a demand for the lumber in the forest. And so they just destroyed huge tracts of this forest. And this action eventually led in the later 19th century to the creation of a national forest movement to preserve forests everywhere in the United States. And so this area was actually a leader in that movement. The first national forest was in North Georgia, in the Chattahoochee National Forest, and it's 700,000 acres in North Georgia. So the culture is a mix of Native American and Appalachian settlers, European settlers, and it's an interesting mix. They influence each other. The Native Americans were originally farmers. They were not just hunter-gatherers. They had farms and towns, and they became more and more settled over time and went from being small farmers to actually trappers and traders in addition to their farming as the European settlers moved in. The Appalachian culture is very independent and very isolated in this area at the time. There's not a lot of roads back there in the 19th century. When they were building the Appalachian Trail, they actually came across a number of people up in the hills that really didn't like them coming in and trying to put this trail through. So there was a lot of just dealing with these very independent folks up in the hills who were just used to being left alone. The natural environment is very rocky. Again, it's a nice change from Florida. You see some rocks, you see some mountains. It's basically a nice bedrock. And you see examples of this when you're hiking through Blood Mountain and in Woody Gap as well. So we'll see those in this presentation. Generally, it's a southern hardwood forest, which we don't see down here. The large deciduous trees, hickory, oak, hemlock, and then some tall pines. And then you also find these rhododendron tunnels over here on the left-hand side. I don't know if you can see that too well, but that's a picture of these little forests of rhododendrons, really beautiful in the early summer. They start to bloom, but they just completely cover the trail. And so you feel like you're walking through these tunnels just covered with flowers. Bears are plentiful in the area. They're an issue when you're hiking, to preserve your food so that the bears don't get them, and so you don't encourage bear behavior of harassing people. Quite a few snakes, rattlesnakes, copperheads, quite a few small mammals. The forest is pretty much at climax now. It's been harvested for lumber for hundreds of years now, but since that has been preserved since 1910, most of the tree cover you find here now is back to its natural state. So the trail itself is across an area in Georgia. It's just nothing like the rest of Georgia. I know many of you have probably been up to North Georgia, but if you've just been in our surrounding area surrounding Northeast Florida, and you know St. Mary's or Savannah or Baldwin or Valdosta, it's nothing like that. It's not flat. It's no peanut farms or peach trees or cotton fields. It's very rugged terrain and fairly elevated. The lowest elevation on the trail in Georgia is 2,500 feet, and the highest is Blood Mountain at 4,461. So that's higher than any point on the Appalachian Trail from Northern Virginia to Massachusetts. So past Georgia, you'll hike through North Carolina and up into the middle of Virginia. And after that, you won't find anything that's as high as Georgia till you get up to Massachusetts. And another thing about the mountains there in Georgia on the trail is it's always going up and down. We call them PUDs, pointless ups and downs. So you just struggle to get to the top of one, and then you're going down another, and then you're going to go up another hill. And it's just like that for the entire stretch. And as you walk it, you get used to it, you get your trail legs, and it's just a very enjoyable terrain. Almost half of the area in Georgia passes through federally designated wilderness, which means you can't go in there with any kind of mechanized equipment to do maintenance. And the trail is maintained by the Georgia Appalachian Trail Club. And so you can go on their website, georgiaatclub.org, and find out about accommodations and supplies as you hike through the trail, how to get shuttles and where to go to get to the trailheads, information on water sources, how available they are. And there's an interactive map there with elevation. And they also partner with communities along the trail that are recognized as trail communities. And some of those in Georgia are Blairsville, Dahlonega, Helen, and Hiawassee. So these are the three sections that I've decided to break the talk up in to talk about. And these sections are actually good for planning a hike. They're each about 30 miles in length. And so that's doable for most people in 3 or 4 days. And they have good trailheads at either end. So you could do the hike this way and, you know, have a few visits of 3 or 4 days each. Of course, that's not the way I did it. It was a lot more haphazard than that. So you'll see as we show you the pictures that, you know, there are different times of year, not in any chronological order as we go through this presentation. But that's okay too. I did the beginning part of the trail, some that we're going to see today, this year, and then other sections I've done in previous years. So the total mileage from the southern terminus in Georgia to the Georgia-North Carolina state line is 78 miles. The total mileage that I'm going to talk about in these presentations is 93 miles. It goes from Amicalola State Park, which we'll talk about in a minute, to Deep Gap, North Carolina, which is a little bit over the state line, but it's the first trailhead where you can drive in to meet the trail after the Georgia state line. And so along the way, there are multiple shelters where you can stay. There are privies at these shelters where you can use the facilities. There are bear cables to hang your food so you don't have to do it yourself with your own ropes. It's very convenient. It's always good to have that capability anyway, but this makes it a really good primitive camping experience with a lot of support. And then some of the shelters have bear boxes where you can put your food in a box. You don't have to hang it, and it's bear proof. So this is a map of the trail in Georgia. And these colors here are the 3 sections that I'm going to talk about. One is Amicalola to Woody Gap. And then next week we'll do Woody Gap to Unicoi. And then after that, we'll go to the border. And as you can see, Atlanta's down here. So it's somewhere just northeast of Atlanta. And here's another view of it. This is kind of tipped on its side. As you can see, north is this way. So you have to kind of rotate this 40 degrees counterclockwise to get the north-south orientation. Here's the border here. So what we're going to talk about tonight is this section right in here. And here's an idea of the elevation, all the changes in the elevation you see throughout this trail. So we're going to start at Amicalola State Park. And that's not the official beginning of the Appalachian Trail, but there is kind of a traditional beginning there, and a hike up what's called the Approach Trail, which goes from Amicalola State Park up to the actual southern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. So that's about an 8-mile hike, and it begins at these beautiful Amicalola Falls. And the falls are approachable through a series of 604 steps if you want to start from the visitor center, and you can hike up and see this view. You can also park at the top, which is what I did, and walk down about 300 steps, and then you see the base of the waterfall. And then from the top of that waterfall, there's the beginning of that approach trail. And along the trail is some just gorgeous views south into the rest of Georgia. You can see very nice trail, really well maintained. It's a little steep in here. That it's a it's a good climb. It's all uphill this whole 8 miles. So here we are at the top of Springer Mountain, which is the actual beginning of the Appalachian Trail, and they have this plaque here signifying that. So about 3.8 miles along the trail, this is an easy section. And you come to this beautiful creek, Stover Creek, little bridge across it, just gorgeous woods we walking through. Then at mile 5.3, we come to what's called Three Forks, which is the confluence of the Nuntahala Creek, the Long Creek, and this Stover Creek that we just saw. And if you walk up the trail a little bit, you'll see these beautiful Long Creek Falls, which is a really nice place to visit. Maybe have a little picnic there. You can camp nearby. It's a beautiful pool at the bottom of that falls where you can take a little dip if you want, get some water. Just a really beautiful place to visit. At mile 12.2, we come to Cooper Gap. It's a pretty rough terrain starting to come into Cooper Gap. Elevation still only 2812. And the Cooper Gap is where the 5th Army Ranger Battalion trains. They do their mountaineering training here. So it's kind of funny. You're walking along in the middle of the woods and all of a sudden you see these old time Army utility vehicles. This one's like a water truck. And we came to a first aid truck, a little first aid Jeep with a white cross on it. And so they see these guys up there training pretty frequently as you're walking through here. Then we come at mile 14 to Justice Creek. So there's a pretty steep set of stairs coming down into the creek and then coming up out of the creek. You cross the creek by stepping across these stones, kind of fun. Then you go to Ramrock Mountain, and there's beautiful views there. That's just before you get into Woody Gap. So you're just starting to come up in elevation here. We're getting up to 3,175 feet, and now you're at mile 19. And finally, you arrive at Woody Gap, which is a great place to park. There's parking on both sides. A lot of day hikers up here, but it's just a great place to start and end your hike. And there's beautiful views here, as you can see. And so this is the end of the first section that I wanted to talk about on the Appalachian Trail tonight. And so we'll begin at Woody Gap and proceed to Unicoi Gap during our next presentation. So that's our presentation.